Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a topic that might just make you appreciate your heated blankets and central air a whole lot more. Why medieval winters weren't just a bit nippy, but truly, soul-crushingly brutal. Imagine, if you will, stepping outside right now. You take a deep breath, and instead of the crisp, cool air of a modern winter, your lungs seize up. The air itself feels like tiny, jagged shards of ice, scraping their way down your throat. Your breath doesn't just mist, it crystallizes, forming delicate, fleeting ghosts in the air that vanish almost as soon as they appear. You pull your threadbare wool cloak tighter, but it feels less like a garment and more like a sieve, letting the gale-force winds tear through to your bones. Your fingers are already numb, clumsy clubs, and the ground underfoot is a treacherous sheet of black ice, hidden beneath a fresh, unforgiving layer of snow. You can see the faint flickering light of your home in the distance, but the thought of the drafts that whistle through every crack, the smoke that chokes your lungs from the meager fire, offers little comfort. Forget your cozy Netflix binge. You probably wouldn't survive this for a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a muddy, rutted track, the kind that turns into a frozen, bone-jarring washboard in winter. The sun, if it even bothers to show its face, hangs low and weak in the sky, a pale, indifferent disk offering no warmth. The world is a study in muted greys, whites and browns, the vibrant greens of summer, the rich golds of autumn, all gone, swallowed by an endless, oppressive chill. You pull your hood further over your head, trying to shield your ears from the relentless wind that seems to carry the very essence of frost. Every gust bites, a physical assault that strips away what little warmth your body might be generating. This isn't just cold. This is a pervasive, insidious cold that seeps into your very marrow, making your teeth ache and your joints creak with every movement. Consider your breath again. In the modern world, a frosty breath is often a charming sign of winter, something you might even try to catch in a photograph. Here, it's a constant, visible reminder of the cold that envelops you, a small, futile cloud against the vast, indifferent expanse of winter. You try to blow on your hands, but they're already beyond the point of simple warming. They're stiff, clumsy, and the skin feels tight, stretched, and painfully dry. You can feel the blood struggling to circulate to your extremities, a faint, tingly ache that warns of something far more serious than just discomfort. You know, it's funny, we talk about chilling to the bone as a metaphor today, but for a medieval peasant, that was less a figure of speech and more a daily reality. One wrong step, one missed day of foraging for fuel, and that chill could become permanent. Your nose begins to run, a clear, icy drip, and you wipe it with the back of your hand, a crude gesture. There are no tissues here, no warm, soft handkerchiefs, just the coarse, scratchy fabric of your sleeve, if you're lucky, or just a quick swipe with a numb palm. The thought crosses your mind that your nose itself feels like it's slowly turning into an icicle. A rather undignified end, you must admit. Historians still argue whether medieval people simply had a higher tolerance for discomfort, or if their constant exposure to such extreme conditions simply meant they were in a perpetual state of low-grade hypothermia. Personally, I'm leaning towards the latter. It's hard to have tolerance when your body is actively shutting down. The landscape around you is silent, save for the moan of the wind and the crunch of your own boots on the frozen earth. The birds have either migrated or are huddled, starving, in what little shelter they can find. The trees stand stark and bare, skeletal fingers reaching towards the leaden sky. Every branch, every twig, seems to vibrate with the cold. You instinctively hunch your shoulders, trying to make yourself smaller, less exposed to the vast, open hostility of the elements. It's a primal response, this desire to curl in on yourself, to conserve every precious calorie of body heat. You realize, with a sinking feeling, that this isn't just a temporary dip in temperature. This is what life is for months on end. There's no quick escape, no warm car waiting, no heated shop to duck into for a hot cocoa. This is your world, you. See a wisp of smoke curling lazily from a distant chimney, a stark reminder of the struggle for warmth. Imagine the constant worry. Is there enough wood? Is the fire big enough? Will it last through the night? Every piece of fuel gathered, every ember nurtured, was a matter of life and death. You probably think about going to the gas station too. Fill up your car or turning up your thermostat. These people, they thought about how many splinters they'd get chopping down a frozen tree with a dull axe, just to avoid shivering themselves to sleep. And don't forget the smoke itself. Medieval homes rarely had proper chimneys, so the smoke from the central hearth often filled the living space, stinging eyes and lungs. You might think, oh, a little smoke, no big deal. But imagine breathing that in and day out, for months. Your lungs would feel like you've been chain smoking a dragon's breath. And while we're on the subject of quirky tidbits, did you know that in some medieval households, particularly in colder regions, people would sleep with farm animals like pigs or cows for warmth? Talk about a shared living space. I mean, it's one thing to cuddle with a cat, but a fully grown sow. That's dedication to not freezing your bits off. The days are incredibly short, the sun barely peeking above the horizon before it begins its rapid descent. Dusk falls quickly, plunging the world into an even deeper, more profound cold. The long, dark nights stretch endlessly, filled with the sounds of creaking timbers, howling winds, and perhaps the distant cry of a starving wolf. Sleep doesn't offer much respite. You're bundled in whatever meager blankets you possess, but the cold seeps through, chilling your nose and exposed ears. You wake frequently, shivering, your muscles aching from the cold. The concept of a good night's sleep was likely a foreign one for much of the medieval population during winter. It was more about, did I survive the night without getting frostbite? The ground is rock hard, frozen solid. Even basic tasks become monumental struggles. Digging for roots, if any could be found, would be impossible. Hauling water from a frozen well or stream would be a battle against the ice. Everything is slowed, hampered, made more difficult by the pervasive cold. Your breath comes out in ragged gasps, small clouds that disappear almost instantly. You realize the profound isolation that winter brought. Roads became impassable, rivers froze, communication dwindled. Communities were cut off, forced to rely entirely on what they had managed to store before the cold truly set in. And if those stores ran low, well, that's a thought too grim to dwell on for long. But it was a constant gnawing fear. So, as you stand there, shivering, watching the feeble light fade, you begin to understand. This wasn't just a season, it was a siege. A relentless, unforgiving assault on body and spirit. And this, my friends, is just the very beginning of our journey into the true horror of medieval. Brace yourselves, because it only gets colder from here. As if the sheer bone-numbing cold wasn't enough, you must now factor in a geological phenomenon that decided to throw a colossal wrench into humanity's plans. The Little Ice Age. Imagine Mother Nature herself deciding to turn down the global thermostat a few extra notches, not just for a season, but for centuries. You're not just dealing with a typical cold snap. You're living through an extended period of global cooling that utterly reshaped life in medieval Europe. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a slow, creeping chill that began subtly in the 13th century, intensified dramatically through the 14th and 15th, and lingered in varying degrees right up until the mid-19th century. So, you're not just having a bad winter, you're living in a series of increasingly bad winters, year after year, generation after generation. Think about it this way. Your grandparents might have told tales of harsher winters, but your winters are demonstrably colder, longer, and more unpredictable than anything they recall. Rivers that rarely froze solid now do so with alarming regularity, making travel by boat impossible for months. Summers become shorter, cooler, and wetter, often too brief to properly ripen crops. This isn't just about feeling a bit chilly. It's about the very foundations of your agrarian society beginning to crack under the strain. Mainstream historical fact: the Little Ice Age is well documented by various proxy records, including tree rings, ice cores, and historical accounts of glacial advances and river freezes. This wasn't just folklore, it was a verifiable climate shift. You try to recall stories from the elders, the whispers of good old days when the harvest was bountiful and the rivers flowed freely for most of the year. But those memories are fading, replaced by the grim reality of perpetually frozen ground and diminished yields. The very air you breathe feels different, sharper, as if the cold itself has condensed into something tangible. You see it in the way the frost clings to every surface, painting the world in stark white and grey, refusing to melt even in the weak midday sun. You know the growing season is truncated, squeezed between late spring frosts and early autumn blizzards. This means less time for crops to mature, less food to store, and less fodder for your animals. It's a vicious cycle, really. Less food means weaker people, weaker animals, and less energy to even cope with the cold. It's like being stuck on a treadmill that's slowly but surely increasing its incline, and you can't get off. One of the quirky tidbits from this era is the phenomenon of frost fairs on the frozen River Thames in London. Imagine an entire river so completely frozen over that people set up markets, roasted oxen, played games, and even printed books directly on the ice. While it sounds like a quaint winter festival, it was actually a stark indicator of the extreme cold brought by the Little Ice Age. These events were far from common before this period, and they certainly don't happen now with modern temperatures. So, while you might look at pictures and think, oh, how fun, remember that the river had to be frozen solid enough to support hundreds of people and substantial structures. That's a level of cold we rarely experience today in densely populated areas. The unpredictable nature of the Little Ice Age winters added another layer of torment. One year might bring a relatively mild cold, lulling you into a false sense of security, only for the next to unleash a blizzard of unprecedented fury, burying villages and wiping out entire herds. This unpredictability made long-term planning, already a challenge, nearly impossible. You're always on edge, always anticipating the worst. Will this winter be the one that finally breaks you? Will your meager stores last? Will your children, already frail from a lifetime of deprivation, survive the brutal nights? It's not just about coping with the cold. It's about living under a constant, crushing weight of uncertainty. Historians still argue whether the Little Ice Age was the primary driver of famines and plagues, or merely an exacerbating factor for an already vulnerable population. Did it cause the widespread suffering, or did it just turn up the volume on problems that were already simmering beneath the surface? Regardless, its impact was undeniable. You see the effects everywhere: the thinner, more sickly livestock, the gaunt faces of your neighbors, the increasing number of abandoned fields that simply aren't worth the effort to cultivate anymore, the sheer energy required just to stay warm and find enough to eat leaves little room for anything else. Forget about grand cathedrals or philosophical debates. Your daily focus is survival. This extended chill also meant that snowfall was often heavier and more persistent. You wake up morning after morning to a fresh blanket of white, not the picturesque kind you see on greeting cards, but a suffocating deep snow that makes travel, hunting, or even gathering firewood a Herculean task. You trudge through drifts that come up to your waist, feeling the precious heat drain from your body with every strenuous step. Your clothes, already damp from exertion, become rigid with ice, chafing your skin. It's like trying to walk through thick, frozen mud, but instead of mud, it's millions of tiny, freezing crystals. Your legs ache, your lungs burn, and the reward is often just a handful of twigs or a frozen animal carcass. Consider the psychological toll. When winter lasts longer, when spring is delayed and summer is meager, hope begins to dwindle. The vibrancy of life that returns with the warmth becomes a distant memory. You live in a perpetually grey, cold world, punctuated by brief, unfulfilling periods of mildness. It's a slow, agonizing grind against the forces of nature, and nature, in this era, is decidedly not on your side. There's no escaping it, no flying south for the winter. You are rooted to this place, to this struggle, and the cold, the pervasive, undeniable cold, is the constant, unyielding master of your fate. It's truly a time when people might have looked at the sky and thought, okay God, seriously, a little sunshine would be nice. But the sun, much like your hopes, remained stubbornly hidden, with the little ice age turning the world into a giant freezer. Your next problem is where you're supposed to live. You probably imagine quaint little cottages with roaring fireplaces, all snug and cozy. Forget that fantasy. Medieval housing, for the vast majority of the population, was less a haven and more a slightly less exposed extension of the outdoors. You're not talking about insulation and double-paned windows here. You're talking about basic structures designed primarily for shelter from rain and wind, with warmth being an optimistic afterthought. Imagine your home now. It's a small one-room hovel, perhaps built of timber frames, with walls plastered with wattle and daub, a charming combination of woven sticks and mud, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. Sounds delightful, right? This isn't exactly renowned for its thermal properties. As the temperature plummets, the mud hardens, cracks appear, and the wind, that persistent, icy foe, finds every single crevice to whistle through. It's like living inside a sieve, or perhaps a rather leaky wicker basket. You can literally feel the drafts on your skin, a constant reminder that the outside world is never truly outside. You might try to plug these gaps with straw or old rags, but it's a losing battle against nature's relentless assault. The roof, often thatched with straw or reeds, might keep out the worst of the snow, but it certainly doesn't offer much in the way of insulation. Snow might pile up on top, offering a tiny bit of insulating value, but that's a double-edged sword. Too much snow and the roof collapses, crushing your meager possessions and possibly you beneath it. Mainstream historical fact: most medieval homes, especially those of peasants, lacked chimneys, meaning smoke from the central hearth filled the living space, before eventually escaping through a smoke hole in the roof or simply through cracks in the walls. So, not only are you freezing, you're also constantly inhaling smoke, which, as you can imagine, is just fantastic for your lungs. It's like living in a permanent, badly ventilated barbecue pit. Your fireplace isn't a cozy, brick-lined hearth with a mantelpiece for your holiday stockings. It's more likely a simple stone-lined pit in the center of the earthen floor. You huddle around it, trying to coax what little heat it generates into your shivering body. The smoke, thick and acrid, stings your eyes and makes you cough, coating the inside of your nose and throat with soot. You wipe your streaming eyes, the back of your hand coming away black. This smoke isn't just an inconvenience. It causes chronic respiratory issues, exacerbating the illnesses brought on by the cold. Imagine trying to sleep in a room constantly filled with smoke, your lungs burning, your eyes watering. Sleep becomes less about rest and more about endurance. 1. Quirky tidbit: some peasant homes actually shared walls, or even the same roof, with their livestock. Imagine waking up to the gentle snores of a cow or the pungent aroma of pigs just a few feet away. While this might sound rather unhygienic, by modern standards, and, well, it offered a crucial, if smelly, benefit: animal body heat. A cow or a few sheep could provide a surprising amount of warmth, making the difference between a truly freezing night and one that was merely brutally cold. So, your furry four-legged neighbors were quite literally your living, breathing, thermal blankets. It's a bit like having a very large, flatulent, but ultimately helpful dog in your living room. Historians still argue whether this practice was primarily for animal protection, human warmth, or a combination of both. Furniture is minimal, usually a rough wooden table, a few stools, and perhaps a straw-filled pallet for sleeping. You don't have separate bedrooms. Everyone in the family, often extended family, sleeps together in the same cramped space, trying to share what little body heat they can generate. Privacy is a luxury unknown to you. The floor, often just packed earth, is perpetually cold and damp, radiating a chill that even the fire struggles to counter. You might lay down some straw for a bit of cushioning and insulation, but it quickly becomes damp, matted, and a breeding ground for pests. Every step you take inside your own home reminds you of the constant battle against the elements. There's no running water, of course, no indoor plumbing. Water has to be fetched from a well or stream, often frozen, and brought inside. This water, once inside, quickly becomes ice cold again, making washing a truly agonizing experience, if you even attempt it. The concept of a warm bath is a ludicrous fantasy. You probably wash only when absolutely necessary, and even then, it's a quick, cold splash. This lack of hygiene, combined with the cramped living conditions, creates a perfect breeding ground for disease, a topic we'll unfortunately have to delve into later. The crowded, unventilated homes we talked about back in section 3. Remember those charming wattle and daub walls and smoky hearths were perfect for spreading airborne diseases. If one person got sick, it was almost guaranteed to sweep through the entire household. You're all huddled together for warmth, sharing the same air, the same meager blankets, and unfortunately, the same germs. It's like a super spreader event happening in miniature, inside your own home, every single night. And with no concept of germ theory, people had no idea why they kept getting sick. They might attribute it to bad humors, divine punishment, or just plain bad luck. One quirky tidbit about medieval hygiene: some wealthier individuals, surprisingly, practiced forms of oral hygiene, using rough cloths and even powdered herbs or charcoal to clean their teeth. But for the vast majority, particularly during winter, such practices were unheard of. Imagine the state of dental health abscesses, rotting teeth, constant pain, all exacerbated by a lack of proper nutrition and cold sensitivity. A toothache, which we fix with a quick trip to the dentist today, could fester into a life-threatening infection in the medieval era. Your entire face might swell up, throbbing with pain, and all you could do was suffer. Historians still argue whether medieval populations developed some natural immunity to certain common ailments due to constant exposure, or if their general ill health simply meant they were in a perpetual state of vulnerability. Beyond respiratory illnesses, the scarcity of food led to widespread malnutrition, which further weakened the immune system and made people susceptible to deficiency diseases. Scurvy, for instance, caused by a lack of vitamin C found in fresh fruits and vegetables, which were non-existent in winter, would manifest as bleeding gums, loose teeth, extreme fatigue, and skin lesions. You'd feel utterly drained, your body screaming for nutrients it couldn't get. Dysentery, often spread through contaminated water or food, and remember, water sources could be compromised when thawing in spring would cause severe diarrhea and dehydration, rapidly leading to death, especially in children and the elderly. The very act of living in winter made you more vulnerable. Your body was constantly expending energy just to stay warm, leaving fewer resources to fight off infection. The damp clothing, the chilled limbs, the lack of restful sleep, all contributed to a state of chronic stress on your system. You'd see children succumbing to what looked like simple colds, their parents helpless to do anything but watch and pray. The death rate during winter months would spike, a grim reaper stalking every village. The fear of illness wasn't abstract. It was a tangible presence, looming over every conversation, every shared meal. You knew that a cough in the night could be the beginning of the end for someone you loved. It's truly a situation where the cure for your ailments was often worse than the disease, given the medieval medical practices. We'll get to those charming methods later. But for now, just imagine trying to get through a bad flu when your best remedy is a prayer and maybe some leeches. Makes you appreciate modern medicine, doesn't it? All right, you're shivering in your smoky, drafty hut, perpetually hungry, and trying to avoid catching the plague from your neighbor's sneeze. What's your main line of defense against the relentless cold? Your clothing. And let me tell you, medieval attire was barely enough to keep a pigeon warm, let alone a human being facing down a little ice age winter. Forget your high-tech waterproof, breathable parkas, your thermal underwear, or your wool-lined boots. You're dealing with rudimentary fabrics, simple designs, and a complete lack of modern manufacturing processes. Imagine trying to brave a Cambodian monsoon season with just a thin cotton sheet. Now extrapolate that feeling to a European winter, and you're getting close to the discomfort of medieval winter clothing. Your primary material was wool. While wool is a fantastic natural insulator, the wool available to the common medieval person was often coarse, scratchy, and of variable quality. It wasn't the fine merino wool you might find in a hiking sock today. It was more akin to wearing a rough, unshorn sheep. You'd layer it, of course, a tunic close to your skin, perhaps a heavier gown or tunic over that, and finally, a cloak for outdoor wear. But layers only work if they're thick enough and if they can trap air effectively. These clothes, often loosely woven, did a poor job of holding in that precious body heat. You pull your wool tunic tighter, but you can feel the icy wind still slicing through the weave. The fabric is damp from the pervasive moisture in the air and your own perspiration from exertion. Damp wool, while still better than damp cotton, loses a significant amount of its insulating power. It chafes your skin, already reddened by the cold, making every movement a minor irritation. There were no soft, breathable inner layers. Your skin would be in constant contact with scratchy, coarse material, leading to rashes and general discomfort. It's like wearing a permanent, woolly sandpaper suit. Your outer garment, a cloak, would be your main protection against wind and snow. But these cloaks often didn't have hoods, or if they did, they were simple affairs that offered little protection to your face. Your head, ears, and nose would be constantly exposed to the biting wind, leading to painful stinging and the constant threat of frostbite. Mainstream historical fact: medieval clothing, especially for the lower classes, was designed for durability and ease of repair rather than optimal thermal performance. It was a practical necessity, not a fashion statement or an engineering marvel. Footwear was another critical weakness. You'd probably be wearing simple leather shoes or boots, often without rigid soles, and certainly not insulated. These would quickly become sodden in snow and slush, leaving your feet wet and numb. Your socks, if you had them, would also be wool, but again, thin and prone to dampness. Imagine walking through deep, freezing mud, feeling the cold seep directly through the soles of your feet. The constant dampness and cold would lead to chilblains, painful swelling and itching of the skin, and in severe cases, trench foot, a debilitating condition where prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions could lead to gangrene and amputation. It's truly miserable, isn't it? Your feet are your primary mode of transport, and they're perpetually cold, wet, and aching. One quirky tidbit: some medieval folk, particularly in colder climates, would stuff their boots or shoes with straw or dry moss for extra insulation. While better than nothing, this improvised padding would quickly become compressed and damp, losing its effectiveness and potentially even contributing to bacterial growth. So, you'd spend your day with cold, squishy feet that also smelled suspiciously like a barn floor. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of foot ailments was due more to poor footwear or to the chronic damp and cold conditions themselves. Was it the shoes, or was it the perpetually frozen mud you were trudging through? A bit of both, probably. Gloves were a luxury for the wealthy. For you, your hands would be bare, or perhaps covered by simple mittens with no separate fingers, making fine motor tasks nearly impossible. Your fingers would quickly turn white and stiff, losing all dexterity. Trying to chop firewood, milk a cow, or even hold a simple tool would be an agonizing challenge, with the constant threat of dropping things or, worse, injuring yourself when your hands were numb with cold. It's a bit like trying to assemble a Lego set while wearing boxing gloves, only with real pain and potential frostbite. And then there's the problem of drying clothes. With no central heating, clothes dried slowly, if at all, over the smoky fire, often retaining a lingering dampness and the smell of soot. You'd put on clothes that were never quite fully dry, perpetuating the chill and increasing the risk of hypothermia. The thought of stepping out of a damp bed into damp clothes on a freezing morning is enough to make anyone pull the covers over their head and cry dot. So, your medieval wardrobe was a study in grim practicality. It kept you from being naked, but it offered precious little comfort or protection against the true brutality of a medieval winter. Every single layer felt inadequate, every gust of wind found its way through, and the constant dampness was a torment. It was a daily battle to simply retain what little body heat you could generate, a battle you frequently lost. You're bundled in your scratchy, damp wool, still shivering from the permeating cold that your inadequate clothing just can't keep out. Your stomach grumbles, reminding you of the dwindling food supplies. Now, let's talk about the absolute bedrock of survival in a medieval winter: fuel, or, more accurately, the constant, desperate fuel crisis. This wasn't about fluctuating gas prices. This was about literally freezing to death because you couldn't find, gather, or afford enough wood or peat to keep a fire going. Imagine your entire existence hinging on a pile of wood. Every morning, your first thought wouldn't be about breakfast, but about the fire. Is there enough kindling? Are the logs dry? Will it last until morning? The warmth of a fire wasn't a luxury, it was the sole defense against the relentless cold, a fragile barrier between you and hypothermia, and maintaining that barrier was a monumental, daily struggle. The primary fuel source was, of course, wood. But wood wasn't just lying around waiting to be picked up. Forests were often owned by lords or the crown, and poaching wood could lead to severe penalties, even death. You might have rights to gather fallen branches, but what about larger logs, needed for a sustained blaze? Felling trees required axes, saws, and immense physical labor, all in freezing conditions. The ground around the trees would be frozen solid, making it difficult to even approach. Imagine trying to swing a heavy axe when your hands are numb and your muscles are stiff with cold. Every blow would send a jarring shockwave up your arms, and your breath would mist in frosty clouds. Mainstream historical fact: deforestation was a significant problem in many parts of medieval Europe, as demand for wood for fuel, building, and industry rapidly outstripped supply. This scarcity drove up prices and made it even harder for the poor to afford adequate heating. So, you weren't just competing with your neighbors for a fallen branch. You were competing with entire industries and the whims of wealthy landowners. Peat, dried, compressed vegetation from bogs, was another fuel source, particularly in regions where wood was scarce. like parts of Ireland or Northern Europe. But harvesting peat was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring digging it out of the bog, drying it for weeks or months, and then transporting it. Imagine trying to do that in the biting wind, with the ground beneath you sodden and frozen. It's back-breaking work for very little return, especially if it rained or snowed during the drying process, rendering your efforts useless. The price of fuel, like food, would skyrocket in winter. If you were lucky enough to have some small surplus to sell, you might afford to buy a small amount of wood from a merchant. But for the vast majority of peasants, buying fuel was out of the question. You relied entirely on what you could gather yourself, which often wasn't enough to keep a fire burning constantly. You'd light it for cooking, for a brief burst of warmth, and then let it die down, huddling together to conserve what little heat remained. This cycle meant hours, or even days, in bone-chilling cold, broken only by fleeting moments of warmth. One quirky tidbit: some desperate medieval peasants, particularly in urban areas where wood was extremely scarce, would collect animal dung like dried cow pats and use it as fuel. While it burns with a lower heat output and produces a lot of smoke, it was a readily available, if less desirable, alternative. So, you might find yourself gathering what you politely refer to as organic combustibles, and the faint, earthy smell of your home might not just be from the wattle and daub. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of dung for fuel was a sign of extreme poverty or a pragmatic use of available resources. Probably a bit of both, but you can bet it wasn't their first choice. The constant need for fuel also limited your movement. You couldn't stray too far from your immediate vicinity to gather wood, especially with the dangers of winter travel, which we'll get to. This meant that nearby forests would be quickly depleted, forcing you to travel further and further, expending precious calories and time in the freezing cold. It's a cruel catch-22. You need fuel to stay warm, but gathering fuel makes you cold. The fight for fuel wasn't just a physical one, it was psychological. The sight of a dwindling woodpile would fill you with dread. The sound of a fresh snowfall, which meant harder foraging, would sink your heart. Your nights would be punctuated by shivers, not just from the cold, but from the anxiety of whether you would wake up warm enough. The concept of running out of gas pails in comparison to the medieval fear of running out of wood. For them, it literally meant running out of life. So, you're cold, hungry, wearing scratchy, damp wool, and desperately trying to keep a smoky, dung-fueled fire alive. Now imagine having to actually go somewhere in the midst of this medieval winter. Forget hopping in your climate-controlled car or catching a train. Travel in medieval winter wasn't just inconvenient. It was a terrifying gamble with death, where every mile was an enemy and every journey a potential last one. You step outside, pulling your threadbare cloak tighter, and immediately feel the brutal reality of the world. The roads, which in summer were muddy, rutted tracks, are now transformed into treacherous ice rinks hidden beneath layers of deep, unforgiving snow. Every step is a calculated risk. You could easily slip, fall, and break a bone, a devastating injury in an age without modern medicine. Imagine lying in a snowdrift with a shattered leg, the cold seeping into your body, knowing that help might not come, or if it does, it could be hours too late. It's like trying to walk across a frozen lake blindfolded, only the lake is also trying to actively kill you. Horses and oxen, essential for carrying goods or pulling carts, struggled just as much, if not more, than humans. Their hooves would slip, they'd stumble in deep drifts, and the sheer effort of moving through the snow would quickly exhaust them. If an animal went lame or died on the road, your entire journey, and possibly your survival, was immediately jeopardized. You might be forced to abandon your meager goods, or even the animal itself, just to save your own life. Mainstream historical fact: medieval roads were poorly maintained, if at all, and often became impassable during severe winter weather, effectively isolating communities for months. There was no Department of Transportation sending out it was just you, your frozen breath, and a whole lot of impassable terrain. Rivers, which in warmer months served as vital arteries for trade and communication, would freeze solid. While this might occasionally allow for those quirky frost fares we mentioned earlier, remember the Thames in Section 2. It more often meant that essential goods couldn't be transported. Boat travel ceased, cutting off entire regions from supplies and markets. If you relied on river trade for your livelihood, winter brought an abrupt halt to your income. You'd stand on the bank, watching the sluggish, icy current, knowing that everything important was stuck somewhere up or downstream. One quirky tidbit: during particularly harsh winters, people would sometimes create makeshift ice roads across frozen rivers or lakes, sometimes even driving carts across them. While faster than trying to navigate deep snow on land, this was incredibly dangerous, with the constant risk of the ice cracking and plunging you, your animals, and your goods into the frigid water below. It's like playing a terrifying game of Russian roulette, but with a whole lot of ice and the immediate threat of hypothermia. Historians still argue whether the perceived danger of these ice roads outweighed their practical benefits, or if desperation simply left people with no other choice. Banditry and brigandage often increased during winter. With resources scarce and people desperate, the roads became even more dangerous. A lone traveler, or even a small group, was an easy target for those driven by hunger and desperation. You'd travel with a heightened sense of fear, constantly scanning the desolate landscape for any sign of trouble, knowing that if you encountered desperate men, your life and meager possessions were at risk. It's like a very, very bleak version of Mad Max, but everyone is just trying to find a warm place and a stale biscuit. Navigation itself was difficult. Snowfall would obscure familiar landmarks, making it easy to get lost in a whiteout. A sudden blizzard could descend, reducing visibility to zero, and the biting wind would whip up the snow, disorienting you completely, wandering off the path. In deep snow, with night falling, was a virtual death sentence. You'd quickly become disoriented, exhausted, and succumb to the cold. The landscape, so familiar in summer, became a bewildering, hostile maze. Even short journeys, say, to a nearby village or market, became arduous expeditions. A trip that might take an hour in summer could take half a day, or even a full day in winter. You had to carry extra food, extra layers, and potentially even emergency fire-starting materials. Every ounce of energy was precious, and journeys rapidly depleted your reserves, making you more vulnerable to the cold and illness. So, next time you complain about a 5-minute drive to the shops, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart, who might have spent 5 hours battling just to get a lump of questionable cheese. It truly puts things into perspective, doesn't it? So, you've battled the bitter winds, trudged through treacherous snow, and perhaps even risked crossing a dubious ice road just to get a glimpse of another village. Now, let's talk about the very foundation of medieval survival, and how winter utterly crippled it. Agriculture's frozen halt. Your entire world, your very existence, was inextricably linked to the land, and come winter, that land became a hard, unyielding, frozen adversary. Imagine your fields, once teeming with green shoots and later golden grain, now buried under a thick, seemingly endless blanket of snow. The ground beneath is frozen solid, impenetrable. You can't plow it, you can't plant it, you can't tend it. The life-giving cycle of the seasons, so vital to your survival, comes to a grinding, agonizing stop. For months on end, the earth offers nothing. It's like Mother Earth decided to take a very long, very cold nap, and she's not waking up anytime soon. Your primary focus during the warmer months was the harvest, storing enough to see your family and your animals through the barren winter. But with the Little Ice Age, remember that persistent chill from Section 2. The growing season was already shorter, cooler, and wetter. This meant smaller yields, crops that struggled to ripen, and a constant nagging fear that your stores simply wouldn't last. A single unseasonable frost in late spring or early autumn could wipe out an entire crop, condemning a village to starvation. Mainstream historical fact: the medieval agricultural system, reliant on manual labor and lacking modern understanding of soil science or crop rotation, was highly susceptible to climate fluctuations, making famine a recurring threat. The concept of winter wheat might exist, planted in autumn for an early spring harvest, but even this was precarious. Deep snow cover could insulate it, but a sudden thaw followed by a hard freeze could kill it. Heavy, persistent snow also meant the fields were buried for longer, delaying spring planting and further shortening the already tight growing season. You'd stand at the edge of your frozen field, looking out at the endless white, counting the days until the thaw, praying for a merciful spring. Each passing day without melt was another day of dwindling supplies. Another day closer to hunger. Livestock, which were an integral part of your agricultural system, providing meat, milk, wool, and labor, also suffered immensely. They needed fodder, and if the hay harvest was poor due to wet summers, your animals would starve. We'll delve deeper into animal welfare soon, but suffice it to say, a dead ox meant not only less food, but also no plow animal for spring, creating a terrible feedback loop of poverty and hunger. You couldn't just pop down to the feed store for a few bags of grain. Everything had to be grown or gathered. One quirky tidbit about medieval agriculture in winter: the practice of winter fallow was common, where fields were left unplanted to rest and regain fertility. While essential for soil health, it also meant a significant portion of arable land was completely unproductive during the winter months, further concentrating the pressure on the active fields. Some historians still argue whether the medieval practice of leaving large portions of land fallow during winter was an efficient use of resources or a testament to the limitations of their agricultural technology. Was it clever rotation, or just making the best of a bad situation? Even tasks that seem simple now, like mending tools or repairing buildings, became difficult in the freezing cold. Leather would stiffen, wood would splinter, and your fingers would be too numb to work with precision. The general halt of agricultural activity also meant widespread unemployment for the landless laborers who relied on seasonal work. With no fields to till, no crops to harvest, and no livestock to tend in the same way, many would be left with no means of support, forced to beg or starve. This created an added layer of social tension and desperation during the leanest months. The long nights meant less daylight for any productive work outside. Your day would be condensed to a few short hours of twilight work, followed by endless, cold darkness. The sheer physical and mental toll of this constant battle against idleness and cold cannot be overstated. You're trapped, waiting, hoping for the earth to awaken, for the sun to reclaim its strength. The frozen earth held your future hostage, and all you could do was endure the endless wait. It's a stark reminder that in the medieval world, nature was the undisputed boss, and in winter, she was a particularly unforgiving one. All right. You're currently imagining a landscape locked in ice, your fields barren and useless, and your belly rumbling with hunger. Now, let's turn our attention to the creatures who often shared your meager existence and suffered alongside you. Animal welfare in medieval winter. While you might be focused on your own freezing toes, remember that your livestock, your beasts of burden, and even the wild animals faced an equally brutal, if not more desperate, struggle for survival. Their suffering directly impacted your own. Imagine your small herd of sheep, or perhaps a cow or two, huddled together in a flimsy, drafty lean-to. They are not insulated in climate-controlled barns with ample feed. These animals are often kept in close quarters, sometimes even in a section of your own smoky hut. Remember that quirky tidbit from section 3 about sharing body heat. While this provided a bit of shared warmth, it also meant poor ventilation, an increased risk of disease for both animal and human. Their breath would mist in the frigid air, their coats thick with frost. You'd hear their low moans, their restless shifts, constantly aware of their discomfort. The most pressing concern for animals in winter was fodder. Grass and fresh forage were, of course, non-existent. Animals relied entirely on hay, straw, and dried leaves collected and stored during the warmer months. But if the summer had been unusually wet or cold, a common occurrence during the Little Ice Age, as we established in section 2, the hay harvest would be poor. Imagine trying to stretch a meager supply of dry, dusty hay across months of cold. You'd carefully dole it out, knowing that every blade counted. Mainstream historical fact: winter starvation was a major cause of livestock death in medieval Europe, particularly during years of poor harvest, significantly impacting both food supply and agricultural labor for the following spring. Malnourished animals were incredibly vulnerable. Their resistance to disease plummeted, and they were more susceptible to parasites and infections. A common animal illness could quickly spread through a small herd, wiping out your entire livelihood. You'd watch them grow thinner, their ribs visible, their movements sluggish. A sick animal meant not only less food for your family, but also a potential loss of essential labor for plowing and transport. The death of an ox, for instance, could cripple a family's ability to farm their land come spring, condemning them to a cycle of poverty and hunger. It's truly a situation where the welfare of your animals was directly tied to your own survival. Water, too, was a constant challenge. Ponds and streams would freeze solid, requiring you to break through ice, often thick and dangerous, to get water for your animals. They needed it to digest their dry fodder and to simply stay alive. Imagine trying to haul heavy buckets of freezing water multiple times a day to a thirsty animal, all while battling the cold yourself. It's an exhausting, relentless chore. Sometimes, if the water source was too far or too frozen, animals would simply go thirsty, further weakening them. One quirky tidbit: during particularly severe winters, even wild animals would become desperate. Wolves, driven by hunger, would become bolder, venturing closer to human settlements in search of prey. This meant an increased threat to your precious, already vulnerable livestock. You'd have to be constantly vigilant, barricading animals at night and perhaps even mounting patrols, all while battling the elements yourself. Imagine trying to protect your emaciated sheep from a pack of starving wolves, while you yourself are half frozen and exhausted. It's a very real-life version of an animal horror movie, playing out right outside your door. Historians still argue whether the increased wolf attacks during medieval winters were purely due to desperation, or if changing land use patterns also played a role. The winter also meant that animals were often kept indoors for prolonged periods, leading to cramped, unsanitary conditions. Mucking out stalls in freezing temperatures was a miserable task, but neglecting it would lead to a buildup of waste, which further encouraged the spread of disease and parasites. The air inside these animal shelters would be thick with the smell of ammonia and manure, contributing to respiratory problems for the animals and anyone sharing their space. So, as you can see, the brutal medieval winter wasn't just a human problem. It was a shared suffering that extended to every living creature that depended on the land. The silent desperation of your starving animals, their shivering bodies, and their ultimate demise would have been a grim and constant reminder of the winter's unforgiving power, a power that directly threatened your ability to survive the coming spring. You're huddled inside, perhaps trying to ignore the mournful bleating of your starving sheep or the way the cow in the corner breathes. You've grappled with the personal battles of cold, hunger, and disease. But the medieval winter's grip extended far beyond your individual farmstead. It seized the very arteries of society. Trade routes iced over. In a world without rapid transportation or global logistics, the freezing of rivers, the impassability of roads, and the general dangers of travel brought commerce to a grinding, sometimes catastrophic, halt. Imagine, if you will, that the only way to get specialized goods, say, salt from a coastal region, iron tools from a mining area, or even grain from a more fortunate district, was by boat along a river, or by horse and cart over dirt tracks. When winter hit, these lifelines became utterly useless. Rivers, as we briefly touched upon, remember those perilous ice roads in Section 8, turned into solid, unmoving blocks of ice, rendering barges and merchant ships entirely redundant. You could be waiting for weeks, even months, for essential supplies to reach your village, as the frozen waterways held everything hostage. Mainstream historical fact: major rivers like the Rhine, Danube, and Seine were crucial arteries for medieval trade, and their freezing for extended periods could cripple regional economies and lead to severe shortages in inland areas. The consequences were far-reaching. If your local blacksmith relied on imported iron ore, his forge might go cold. If your village traded surplus wool for much-needed grain, that exchange would cease, leaving you with a glut of one commodity and a desperate shortage of another. The specialized crafts and goods that distinguished medieval towns became isolated. Imagine trying to run a business today if Amazon, FedEx, and every single road and waterway just stopped. That's the kind of economic paralysis medieval winter inflicted. Roads, too, were little better. Even if not entirely impassable due to snowdrifts, as discussed in Section 8, they were incredibly slow and dangerous. Merchants, already wary of brigands, would be even less inclined to risk their valuable goods, their animals, and their lives on treacherous frozen paths. The cost of transport would skyrocket, making even basic necessities exorbitantly expensive for those who couldn't produce them locally. You'd see prices in local markets soar for anything brought in from outside, making essentials unattainable for the poor. It's truly a situation where the supply chain bottleneck wasn't a shipping container stuck in a canal, but simply a river that turned into a giant, unforgiving ice cube. One quirky tidbit related to this: during prolonged freezes, enterprising individuals in some cities would set up temporary markets directly on the frozen rivers, selling goods to those brave enough to venture out onto the ice. While a testament to human ingenuity, it also underscores the desperation of the situation. Normal trade channels were so completely disrupted that this risky temporary solution was seen as viable. Historians still argue whether these makeshift ice markets were truly effective in alleviating shortages, or if they were more symbolic gestures of resilience in the face of impossible conditions. The impact wasn't just on goods. It was on people and information too. Messengers would be delayed. News would travel slowly or not at all. You could be completely cut off from the outside world, unaware of events in neighboring towns, let alone distant kingdoms. This isolation contributed to a sense of profound vulnerability and uncertainty. The world outside your immediate frozen hamlet might as well have ceased to exist. This economic stagnation had a brutal ripple effect. With trade halted, artisans lost their income. Farmers couldn't sell any meager surpluses if they even had them. Laborers had no work. The flow of coin would slow to a trickle, exacerbating the poverty that already gnawed at the edges of society. Taxes might still be demanded, but how could you pay when your livelihood was literally frozen solid? The economic engine of medieval society shuddered to a halt, plunging communities deeper into distress. So, while you might think of winter's brutality as purely a physical hardship, understand that its impact on trade routes created an economic and social crises that compounded all other sufferings. It turned isolated communities into islands in a sea of ice and snow, forcing them to survive solely on their own rapidly depleting resources. It was a stark reminder that prosperity, even survival, was deeply interconnected. And when those connections froze, so too did the hopes of many. You've shivered through the reality of inadequate housing, gnawed on the bone of hunger, worried about pervasive disease, felt the inadequacy of your clothing, fought for every stick of fuel, and watched helplessly as trade routes froze solid. Now, let's peel back another layer of the medieval winter experience, one that chills you from the inside out. The psychological toll. Beyond the physical hardships, enduring months of relentless cold, darkness, and scarcity chipped away at the human spirit, fostering a profound sense of dread, isolation, and often despair. Imagine waking up, day after day, to the same oppressive grey sky, the same biting wind, the same seemingly endless stretch of frozen landscape. The days are short, the nights are long, and the sun, when it appears, offers little warmth and even less hope. This lack of light, combined with the constant struggle for survival, would deeply affect your mental state. Seasonal affective disorder. SAD isn't a modern invention. The impact of prolonged darkness on mood is very real. You'd feel a heavy weariness that sleep couldn't cure, a listlessness that made even simple tasks feel monumental. It's like living in a perpetual state of low-grade emotional hypothermia. The isolation, as trade routes froze and travel became perilous, remember Section 8, would compound this feeling. Your village would become an island, cut off from news, from family in other settlements, from the vibrant bustle of markets. The sense of being alone in a hostile world would be overwhelming. You'd crave human connection, a break from the monotonous, grim reality of your daily struggle. The very silence of a snow-covered landscape, so peaceful to us, would have been deafening in its emptiness, amplifying your anxieties. Mainstream historical fact. While medieval people didn't have terms like depression or seasonal affective disorder, historical accounts and medical treatises of the time describe conditions that align with these modern diagnoses, often attributed to imbalances of humors or spiritual affliction, but clearly linked to the hardships of winter. The human mind, just like the body, buckles under sustained stress and deprivation. The constant anxiety about basic survival food, fuel, warmth, would be a perpetual background hum in your mind, flaring into outright panic when supplies dwindled. Every empty sack of grain, every disappearing log from the woodpile, would be a fresh stab of fear. You'd lie awake at night, listening to the wind howl, picturing your children's gaunt faces, wondering if you'd be able to keep them alive until spring. This isn't just stress, it's a form of sustained psychological torture. It's like living with a ticking clock, but you don't know when it will go off, or what disaster it will signal. Death, already a constant companion in medieval life, became even more prevalent in winter, especially among the very young and the very old. Witnessing loved ones succumb to preventable illnesses or slowly starve would inflict profound grief and trauma. The frozen ground would make burials difficult, adding another layer of grim reality to the process of mourning. You might have to wait for the spring thaw to properly inter your dead, leaving a constant morbid reminder of loss. One quirky tidbit: to combat the overwhelming darkness and sense of despair, communities would often cling fiercely to traditional festivals and celebrations, even in the harshest of winters. Candlemas, for instance, a Christian festival marking the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, would be a time for lighting candles, feasting on what little food could be spared, and gathering together. These were not just religious observances, they were vital psychological survival mechanisms, brief moments of light and hope in the crushing darkness. Historians still argue whether the increased emphasis on community rituals during winter was a spontaneous response to shared hardship or a deliberate reinforcement of social bonds by the church. The lack of control over your circumstances would breed a profound sense of powerlessness. You couldn't stop the snow from falling or the temperatures from plummeting. You couldn't magically make crops grow or bring trade back to life. You were utterly at the mercy of nature, and this helplessness could be incredibly soul-destroying. It's the kind of feeling that makes you want to curl up in a ball and simply cease to exist. So, while the physical pain of medieval winter was excruciating, never underestimate the relentless psychological battery it inflicted. The constant fear, the pervasive darkness, the isolation, the sheer hopelessness of it all. These invisible wounds were just as devastating, if not more so, than frostbite or hunger, leaving a lasting imprint on the medieval psyche. You're wrestling with the profound psychological toll of endless winter, the gnawing dread of scarcity, and the crushing weight of isolation. As if your personal struggles weren't enough, you also realize how limited the support system around you truly is. This brings us to a stark reality of medieval winter: governance and helpless rulers. In an era before organized welfare states, comprehensive emergency services, or sophisticated logistics, the ability of lords, kings, or even the church to alleviate the widespread suffering caused by winter was incredibly limited, often bordering on non-existent. Imagine going to your local lord, or the king's representative, and asking for help because your family is starving and freezing. What do you think would happen? You'd likely be met with a shrug, or perhaps a sermon on divine providence, or at best, a small, inadequate handout that wouldn't last a day. The very structures of power were simply not equipped to deal with widespread humanitarian crises on the scale that medieval winters, especially those exacerbated by the Little Ice Age, could inflict. Their primary concerns were taxes, maintaining order, and warfare which, ironically, winter often paused, as we'll see later. Mainstream historical fact: medieval governments had no concept of a social safety net, and their capacity for large-scale relief efforts was severely constrained by limited resources, poor infrastructure, and a decentralized political structure. Famine relief, if it happened at all, was typically localized and insufficient. It wasn't that rulers were necessarily evil, but their administrative capabilities were simply not up to the task of feeding and warming an entire populace during widespread hardship. Feudal obligations meant you owed your lord labor, loyalty, and taxes, often in kind, meaning a portion of your harvest. But if your harvest failed due to the cold, remember Section 9, agriculture's frozen halt, how could you pay? The lord might be slightly more lenient, but he also had his own household to feed and his own soldiers to maintain. His priorities often lay in securing his own survival and power, not necessarily in the well-being of every shivering peasant. You were largely on your own. It's a bit like complaining to the CEO of a company that your individual desk lamp is flickering when the entire building's power grid is collapsing. Different scales, different concerns. Even if a benevolent lord or a charitable monastery wanted to help, their resources were finite. They too depended on local harvests and were affected by the frozen trade routes, Section 11. What little surplus they had might be quickly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the suffering. You might get a bowl of thin gruel or a small bundle of firewood, but it would be a drop in the ocean against the tide of misery. You'd be grateful, but it would be a fleeting respite, not a solution. One quirky tidbit: some monastic orders were indeed known for their charitable efforts, distributing food and tending to the sick during famines and harsh winters. However, even their efforts were often limited to their immediate vicinity and dependent on their own accumulated wealth, which could also be depleted by successive bad years. So, while a monk might offer you solace and a warm drink, he couldn't magically make food appear from thin air if his own granaries were empty. Historians still argue whether the charitable efforts of the church were primarily driven by genuine altruism or by a strategic need to maintain social order and the loyalty of the populace during times of crisis. Probably a mix, as with most things human. The distance between the ruler and the ruled was vast, not just geographically, but socially and economically. The king, in his relatively warm castle, might hear reports of famine in a distant province, but the direct, visceral reality of frozen limbs and empty bellies would be far removed from his experience. Decision-making was slow, communication was poor, especially in winter, and effective action was rare. By the time a royal decree about relief might reach your village, many would have already perished. You were, in essence, left to your own devices. Your best hope was your immediate family, your closest neighbors, and the resilience you could muster yourself. There was no governmental emergency aid, no disaster relief agency knocking on your wattle and daub door. The concept of collective responsibility for the well-being of the populace was nascent, at best, and utterly inadequate in the face of medieval winter's ferocity. This realization would add another layer to your psychological burden. Not only are you suffering, but there is seemingly no higher power on earth capable of truly helping you. Section 14. You've acknowledged the grim truth that no benevolent ruler or well-funded agency is coming to save you from the medieval winter. So, when the coughing starts, remember that pervasive disease from Section 5. Or the chilblains turn angry red, or someone simply collapses from weakness. What do you do? This brings us to a truly grim aspect of medieval life: medical practices and futile efforts. The attempts to cure winter-borne ailments were often rudimentary, based on a mix of superstition, observation, and theories that, by modern standards, were wildly off the mark, making recovery often a matter of sheer luck or robust constitution, rather than effective treatment. Imagine you've developed a severe respiratory infection. Your chest aches, you're struggling to breathe, and you're racked with a fever. Your local physician, who might be a barber surgeon, a wise woman, or simply a knowledgeable elder, would likely rely on the prevailing medical theory of the time: humorism. This belief held that your body was composed of 4 basic humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and illness was caused by an imbalance. So, if you had a fever, it might be due to too much hot blood. What's the solution? Bloodletting. They might cut a vein or apply leeches to literally drain some of your blood, believing it would restore balance. You'd feel weaker, colder, and probably even sicker, all while your body, already fighting off infection and cold, was further depleted. Mainstream historical fact: bloodletting was a common, widely accepted medical practice throughout the medieval period, despite often weakening already vulnerable patients. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky bucket by drilling more holes in it. Or perhaps you're suffering from the aches and pains of cold, or a mysterious rash. The remedy might involve purging, giving you powerful emetics to induce vomiting, or strong laxatives to induce diarrhea. The idea was to expel the bad humors or toxins from your body. So, you'd be shivering, weak from hunger, and now violently ill, further dehydrating you and sapping your strength. Imagine trying to recover from a serious illness while also constantly running to the outdoor privy in sub-zero temperatures. It's truly a nightmare. For frostbite, which would be a constant threat to your exposed hands and feet, the treatments were equally grim. They might involve rubbing the affected area with snow, which actually makes it worse, applying warm if you could get them, or, in severe cases, amputation without anesthesia. Imagine the agony, the crude tools, the very real risk of infection. Remember the lack of hygiene from Section 5. Afterwards, a simple patch of frostbite could lead to a permanent disability or even death. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. One quirky tidbit about medieval medicine in winter: The use of various herbal remedies, often passed down through generations, was widespread. While some herbs did possess genuine medicinal properties, like willow bark for pain relief, a natural source of aspirin, many were based purely on superstition or ineffective beliefs. You might be given a concoction of strange roots and berries, or told to wear an amulet, or perhaps even subjected to bizarre rituals to ward off evil spirits thought to cause illness. Historians still argue whether the cumulative effect of these herbal remedies was beneficial or largely placebo, or if some actually caused more harm than good due to toxicity or incorrect dosages, the lack of sanitation and understanding of germ theory meant that any medical intervention carried a high risk of secondary infection. Surgical procedures, whether for setting bones or attempting to remove a growth, were performed without sterile instruments or antiseptic. A simple cut could quickly become gangrenous, spreading infection throughout your body. You'd see people die from what we consider minor injuries today, simply because the body's natural defenses were overwhelmed and there was no way to stop the infection. So, when you were sick in medieval winter, your chances of recovery depended less on the doctor and more on your own body's resilience, or perhaps, as people believed, on divine intervention. Medical practices, far from being a comfort, were often another source of misery and a potential pathway to a quicker demise. You'd face the pain of illness, the fear of death, and the often agonizing and ineffective treatments all at once, making the winter's bite even more terrifyingly final. You might just decide a prayer was more effective than a physician, and frankly, in many cases, you wouldn't be wrong. You've just shuddered at the thought of medieval medical cures, realizing that when sickness came in winter, you were truly on your own. But despite the relentless physical and psychological assaults, humans are, surprisingly, resilient creatures. And so, to counteract the profound despair, medieval communities developed cultural responses, grim celebrations. These weren't joyous, carefree parties. They were vital acts of defiance against the brutal reality of winter, often infused with a deep sense of desperation and at best desperate longing for the return of light and life. Imagine the sheer emotional weight of weeks, sometimes months, of unbroken cold, hunger, darkness, and isolation. The human spirit, like a tender plant, needs sunlight to thrive. With the sun barely showing its face, remember those short, gloomy days from Section 12, the psychological toll. Communities, consciously or unconsciously, sought ways to create their own light, their own warmth, and their own sense of connection. These celebrations were less about fun and more about survival, psychological bracing for the continued assault. Christmas, or the Yule season, was, of course, a major anchor. But forget the commercialized cheer, you know. Medieval Christmas was a complex blend of pagan traditions, celebrating the winter solstice and Christian reverence for the birth of Christ. It was a period when labor might temporarily cease, when families tried to gather what little food they could spare for a meager feast. You'd burn a Yule log, hoping its prolonged burning would symbolize the return of the sun's strength. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval Christmas celebrations, while centered on religious observance, also incorporated widespread feasting, gift-giving, often practical items, and communal gatherings, providing a crucial psychological break from the hardships of winter. These feasts, however, would be a stark contrast to modern abundance. Your feast might consist of salted meat, if you had any, from Section 4's food scarcity, hard bread, and maybe some fermented drink like ale. It was about eating what little you had, making it stretch, and sharing it rather than indulging. You'd raise your crude wooden cup, perhaps, and feel a flicker of shared warmth, not from the fire, but from the faces around you, illuminated by its smoky glow. The laughter would be a bit strained, perhaps, but it was laughter nonetheless, a defiant sound against the howl of the wind. Outside, one quirky tidbit about medieval winter celebrations: the tradition of where masked and costumed performers would go from house to house, singing, dancing, and performing plays, was quite popular. These performances were often raucous, sometimes satirizing local figures, or simply bringing a moment of levity and spectacle. Imagine a group of strange, masked figures appearing at your door in the dead of winter, bringing with them a brief burst of color and sound. It was a distraction, a momentary escape from the grim reality, offering a communal bond through shared entertainment. Historians still argue whether these mumming traditions were primarily a form of popular entertainment, a way to solicit charity, or a deeper expression of folk magic to ward off the winter's darkness. Beyond Christmas, other festivals punctuated the long winter. Epiphany, the Feast of Fools, a rather chaotic and irreverent celebration, and Candlemas, as mentioned briefly in section 12, marking the return of light, all offered excuses for communal gathering, prayer, and moments of shared ritual. These were not simply religious observances, they were critical social events. They broke the monotony, reinforced community bonds, and provided a sense of shared humanity in the face of shared suffering. You might not have much, but you had each other, huddled together, singing, telling stories, and reaffirming that you were not entirely alone in this frigid world. The storytelling would be particularly vital. Gathered around the meager fire, people would recount tales of heroes, saints, and mischievous spirits. These narratives provided escapism, entertainment, and often moral lessons. They were a way to pass the incredibly long dark hours, a way to transmit culture and history, and a way to remind each other that spring, though distant, would eventually return. The flickering firelight would cast dancing shadows on the walls, transforming your humble hut into a theater where stories of warmth and vibrancy temporarily eclipsed the cold reality. While medieval winters were undeniably brutal, these grim celebrations were an essential balm for the soul. They were a collective exhale, a moment of shared humanity and hope against the backdrop of pervasive dread. They were a testament to the enduring human need for light, community, and the promise of a better tomorrow, even when tomorrow seemed impossibly far away. You've just shared in the grim celebrations, those desperate sparks of light in the endless darkness of a medieval winter. Now, let's consider an activity that, for much of the year, defined the ambitions and struggles of kings and lords: warfare's winter pause. While individual survival was a relentless battle against the elements, the large-scale organized violence that so often plagued medieval Europe often found itself grinding to a frozen halt when winter's true brutality set in. Imagine an army in the field, not a modern army with heated barracks, supply lines stretching for hundreds of miles, and advanced logistics. We're talking about men, often on foot or horseback, wearing basic armor and woolen tunics. Remember those inadequate clothes from section 6. They'd be camped in flimsy tents, or perhaps trying to commandeer a barn, all while the biting wind howled and snow piled up around them. Their food would be limited to what could be carried or foraged, and their fuel supplies would be constantly dwindling. Echoes of section 7, the fuel crisis, right? Trying to conduct a military campaign in these conditions was, for the most part, an exercise in futility and self-destruction. Soldiers would succumb to exposure, frostbite, and disease in staggering numbers. Imagine trying to mount a siege when your men can barely hold their weapons because their hands are numb, or when the ground is too frozen to dig trenches, or when your supply wagons are stuck in waist-deep snowdrifts. A problem for travel, as we discussed in section 8. It simply wasn't practical. Mainstream historical fact: large-scale military campaigns in medieval Europe typically ceased during the winter months, resuming only when the weather improved in spring. The difficulties of supply, movement, and maintaining troop health made winter warfare prohibitively costly in lives and resources. Sieges, which often defined medieval warfare, became particularly challenging, Freezing temperatures would make it impossible to use water-based siege engines, and the ground would be too hard to undermine castle walls. Besieging forces would suffer far more than the defenders, who at least had the shelter of their fortifications. You'd be looking at a situation where the cold itself became the most formidable enemy, decimating armies without a single arrow being fired. It was a more effective deterrent than any stone wall. One quirky tidbit: while large campaigns ceased, smaller skirmishes or raiding parties might still venture out during winter, often driven by desperation for food and resources. These were typically quick, brutal affairs, aimed at seizing supplies from vulnerable villages rather than achieving strategic objectives. Imagine being a peasant, already starving, and then having to face a small, desperate band of soldiers who are even hungrier than you are. Historians still argue whether these winter raids were primarily opportunistic or if they reflected a calculated strategy by commanders to keep their men fed and prevent mutiny. The logistics of supplying an army in winter were nigh impossible. Food would spoil or freeze solid. Animals, essential for transport and cavalry, would weaken and die from lack of fodder and exposure. Recall Section 10 on animal welfare. Rivers, as we know, would freeze, cutting off waterborne supply lines. Section 11, Eastover trade routes. Moving heavy equipment, like trebuchets or siege towers, through deep snow and over frozen, uneven terrain was simply beyond the capabilities of medieval technology and labor. Instead, armies would typically go into winter quarters, often disbanding for a period, or settling into garrisons where they would try to survive the cold months. This meant commanders had to find ways to feed and house large numbers of men and horses, putting an immense strain on local resources and often leading to widespread plunder and imposition on the civilian population. So, even if the battles stopped, the burden of supporting an army often didn't, simply shifting from the battlefield to the villages. This winter pause in warfare offered a strange, almost ironic, respite for the common people, while they still grappled with the personal miseries of the season. At least they generally didn't have to fear the marching boots of an invading army or the ravages of war on top of everything else. It was a brief, tenuous peace enforced not by diplomacy, but by the sheer, unyielding power of nature. And it was a stark reminder that even the most ambitious human endeavors ultimately bowed to the dictates of the medieval winter. You've just considered how even the grand machinations of war had to yield to the brutal realities of a medieval winter. Now, let's pivot back to your immediate, personal struggle, and one of its most desperate facets: resource management, hoarding, and despair. In a world defined by scarcity and unpredictability, every family, every individual, had to become a meticulous, often paranoid, manager of their meager resources, knowing that a single misstep could mean starvation or freezing to death. Imagine your granary, or more likely, just a corner of your smoky hut, where your precious stores are kept. Every bushel of grain, every dried fish, every bundle of firewood is counted, mentally tallied against the looming months of barrenness. This isn't just about meal planning. It's about a constant, grinding calculation for survival. You're not thinking about gourmet recipes. You're thinking about how to stretch a handful of oats into a week's worth of calories. It's a bit like playing a real-life, incredibly high-stakes game of Tetris with your food supply, where, if you miscalculate, the blocks don't just disappear. You do. The psychological burden of this constant rationing is immense, echoing that dread we talked about in Section 12. You're constantly making difficult choices. Do I eat enough to feel full today? Or do I save a little bit more for tomorrow, knowing that tomorrow might be even worse? The desire for immediate comfort battles with the terrifying prospect of future deprivation. And for your children, watching their hungry faces, the choice becomes even more agonizing. You might skip meals yourself, giving your portion to a younger, more vulnerable family member, feeling the gnawing pangs of hunger in your own stomach. Mainstream historical fact: rationing and severe food shortages were common strategies for survival during medieval winters, often leading to widespread malnutrition and heightened vulnerability to disease. Every resource, no matter how small, becomes incredibly valuable. The straw you use for bedding, remember those drafty huts from Section 3, might be repurposed for animal fodder if the hay runs out, linking to animal welfare in Section 10. Every scrap of dried dung is considered for fuel, that quirky tidbit from Section 7. Nothing is wasted, because waste means death. This obsessive conservation often came at the cost of comfort, hygiene, and even basic health. You might endure damp bedding or a perpetually cold house because the alternative was worse. Hoarding, though often seen as selfish, was a necessary survival strategy. If you had a slight surplus one year, you wouldn't openly display it. You'd hide it, protect it, knowing that neighbors or even desperate soldiers remember those small, hungry raiding parties from Section 16, might try to take it. Trust would be a fragile commodity, tested by the sheer desperation of the season. It's not that people were inherently mean. They were just trying to keep their families alive, and in a zero-sum game, someone else's gain often meant your loss. One quirky tidbit about winter resource management: in some communities, there was a practice of gleaning, allowing the poor to collect any leftover grains or produce from fields after the main harvest. While this provided a meager supplement, it also meant that every last scrap was truly valuable, highlighting the intensity of resource scarcity. But come winter, even gleaning would yield little. Historians still argue whether gleaning was a true act of charity or simply a way for landowners to maintain a minimal workforce by ensuring basic survival, thus preventing total social collapse. The contrast between rich and poor would become starker in winter. While you, the peasant, were meticulously counting every crumb, the lord in his castle, though perhaps inconvenienced by the cold and frozen trade Section 11, would still have far greater stores and resources, able to weather the storm with relative comfort. This disparity would breed resentment, a bitter taste in your mouth as you shivered and hungered. So, the medieval winter forced you into a constant state of hypervigilance regarding your resources. Every decision was a life or death calculation, every possession a potential lifeline. The emotional weight of this perpetual crisis, the struggle between hope and despair, the constant fear of running out, shaped the very fabric of your daily existence, leaving no room for comfort, leisure, or even peace of mind. It was a brutal lesson in true scarcity. You've just navigated the desperate landscape of medieval resource management, where every morsel and every twig held the weight of survival. Now, let's consider another profound impact of the brutal medieval winter: technological stagnation. When simply staying alive consumed every ounce of energy and every waking thought, there was little room for innovation, for pushing the boundaries of what was known or how things were done. The relentless focus on basic survival effectively put a chokehold on progress. Imagine, for a moment, the mental state required for innovation. You need curiosity, leisure, surplus resources to experiment, and a degree of security to pursue abstract ideas. None of these were readily available during a medieval winter. Your mind was entirely consumed with the immediate, visceral problems: finding food, staying warm, avoiding illness, keeping your family alive. There was no bandwidth left for contemplating how to build a better plow or invent a more efficient loom. Your intellectual energy was utterly drained by the daily grind. It's like trying to compose a symphony while running from a bear. Your priorities are very much elsewhere. The tools and techniques you had were the ones passed down through generations, proven to work, however inefficiently, in normal times. Trying to develop new methods, new tools, or new agricultural practices would require time, materials, and a willingness to risk failure. Failure, in winter, could mean death. If a new seed variety failed to grow in a particularly cold summer, a common occurrence during the Little Ice Age, which we explored in Section 2, your family could starve. If a new building technique resulted in a less insulative wall, your family could freeze, recalling those drafty huts from Section 3. The risks simply outweighed any potential reward for the average person. Mainstream historical fact: while the medieval period saw some technological advancements, like improvements in watermills and windmills, the overall pace of innovation was slow compared to later eras, partly due to the constant demands of subsistence living and the limited surplus for investment in new ideas. The pressures of survival often left little room for significant, systemic improvements. Even if you had an idea for an improvement, the materials needed for experimentation might be scarce or too valuable to risk. Iron for a new tool, wood for a prototype, or even spare grain to feed someone while they worked on an invention. All these resources were diverted to immediate survival needs, a direct link to resource management in Section 17. The very infrastructure that supports innovation, like stable markets which were frozen over in winter, as per Section 11, or accessible knowledge, simply wasn't robust enough. One quirky tidbit about this stagnation: while practical innovations were slow, the intellectual focus sometimes shifted to more metaphysical or spiritual endeavors during the long, dark winter nights. Scholars in monasteries might spend more time on theological debates or copying manuscripts by flickering candlelight, as external activities were severely limited. So, while you weren't inventing a new farming implement, someone, somewhere, might have been arguing passionately about the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin. Historians still argue whether this intellectual shift was a conscious adaptation to winter's constraints or simply a byproduct of the harsh physical limitations. The lack of consistent communication and travel, as detailed in Section 8, also hindered the spread of ideas. Even if a clever innovation emerged in one village, it might take years, if ever, for that knowledge to reach other communities, especially when winter isolated regions for months on end. There was no scientific journal, no patent office, no YouTube tutorial. Knowledge was often localized, passed down orally, and slow to disseminate. So, the brutal medieval winter wasn't just a season of physical suffering. It was a period of arrested development for much of society. The sheer, overwhelming pressure to simply exist consumed all available energy, imagination, and resources, pushing the grand sweep of human progress into a glacial crawl. You were stuck, literally and figuratively, in a frozen moment, waiting for the thaw to even begin to think about moving forward. You've explored the icy grip of technological stagnation, understanding how sheer survival overshadowed all else. Yet, despite this seemingly insurmountable array of challenges, the chilling climate, the flimsy homes, constant hunger, rampant disease, inadequate clothing, desperate fuel needs, perilous travel, agricultural collapse, suffering animals, frozen trade, psychological despair, helpless rulers, and primitive medicine. There was a fundamental human trait that always shone through: resilience and adaptation. People didn't just lie down and die, though many certainly did. They found ingenious, if often brutal, ways to endure, to bend without breaking completely. Imagine the sheer tenacity required to wake up every morning to a world actively trying to kill you, and still find the will to chop wood, tend to a sick child, or trudge through snow for a meager meal. This wasn't just physical toughness. It was a profound mental fortitude, an almost instinctive drive to persevere against overwhelming odds. You learned to live with discomfort, to expect the worst, and to celebrate the smallest reprieve. It's a bit like being constantly punched in the face, but still managing to stand up, spit out a tooth, and keep going. One of the key adaptations was the development of highly localized, tight-knit communities. Remember the isolation from frozen trade and travel sections 8 and 11. This forced people to rely entirely on their immediate neighbors. Bartering of scarce goods, sharing of labor, and communal support became absolutely vital. If your ox died, your neighbor might lend you theirs. If your child was sick, the village-wise woman might offer a herbal remedy, even if, as we saw in section 14, it was often futile. This collective survival mechanism was perhaps the most powerful tool against winter's brutality. Mainstream historical fact: mutual aid and communal cooperation were essential for survival in medieval peasant communities, especially during periods of extreme hardship like severe winters. People also adapted their daily routines to the rhythm of the cold and darkness. Work hours would shift, with more time spent on indoor tasks like mending tools, weaving textiles if you had the raw materials, or preparing simple, long-cooking meals over the precious fire. The long nights, rather than being a void, became periods for storytelling, minor crafts, and simple social interaction, echoing those grim celebrations from section 15. The pace of life slowed dramatically, dictated by the brutal constraints of the season. You learned to embrace the enforced idleness as a necessary pause, a time for quiet endurance. Dietary adaptations were also crucial. While fresh produce was impossible, people became incredibly adept at preserving food through drying, salting, and fermenting, linking back to food scarcity in section 4. They knew which wild edibles could be safely gathered in late autumn and stored for winter, or which roots might still be viable under the snow. They understood the subtle signs of changing weather and adapted planting schedules accordingly, even if imperfectly referencing agriculture's halt in section 9. It was an intuitive, generational knowledge, hard-won through countless harsh winters. One quirky tidbit of medieval adaptation in some areas, particularly mountainous regions with heavy snowfall, people developed specialized, wider snowshoes, or even early forms of skis to navigate the deep snow. While rudimentary compared to modern equipment, these allowed for hunting, trapping, and limited travel that would otherwise be impossible. So, while technological innovation was stagnant overall section 18, very specific, immediate problems sometimes spurred practical, localized solutions. Historians still argue whether these specific regional adaptations spread much beyond their immediate areas or remained isolated pockets of ingenuity. Perhaps the most profound adaptation was psychological. People developed an incredible stoicism, a hardened acceptance of their difficult lot. They didn't expect comfort or ease. Their hopes were modest, simply to survive, to see the spring, to feel the sun's warmth again. This low expectation, while perhaps bleak, was also a form of psychological defense, cushioning them against constant disappointment. They found solace in faith, in the promise of eternal reward, and in the sheer determination to live another day. This unwavering spirit, the quiet refusal to give up, is arguably the most inspiring legacy of those brutal medieval winters. You've witnessed the incredible resilience of medieval folk, their quiet defiance in the face of unrelenting brutality, and their ingenuity in adapting to a world that seemed determined to break them. Now, as our journey through the medieval winter draws to a close, let's consider its enduring legacy. Echoes of cold. The experiences of those long, dark centuries weren't just fleeting hardships. They cast long shadows, shaping subsequent eras in subtle and profound ways, influencing everything from architecture to social structures, and even our modern perception of winter itself. Imagine the collective memory of generations who lived through the Little Ice Age. This wasn't something easily forgotten. The constant threat of famine, the fear of freezing, the memory of loved ones lost to winter's grip, these experiences were woven into the very fabric of society. This collective trauma subtly influenced how future generations planned, built, and even thought about the seasons. It wasn't just a historical event. It was a deeply ingrained, almost genetic, cautionary tale. Consider architecture. While modern heating eventually made medieval building practices obsolete, the lessons learned from those drafty, smoky huts, remember Section 3, cold comforts, lingered. The need for thicker walls, smaller windows, and more efficient hearths remained a priority for centuries, gradually evolving into better insulated structures. Even the concept of a dedicated, internal fireplace with a chimney, a relatively late medieval innovation, was a direct response to the desperate need for better indoor heating. It's a testament to the ingenuity born from desperation. Mainstream historical fact: the development of more sophisticated domestic heating methods, including improved fireplaces and chimneys, slowly gained traction in the late medieval and early modern periods, partly driven by the necessity of coping with colder climates. The emphasis on preservation and storage also left a lasting mark. The techniques for salting meat, drying fruits, and storing grains became refined over centuries, linking back to food scarcity in Section 4 and resource management in Section 17. Even today, many traditional food preservation methods have their roots in this era, a direct inheritance from a time when every calorie counted. We might romanticize homemade jams now, but back then, they were life-sustaining. The social structures themselves were reinforced by winter's demands. The necessity of strong community bonds, of mutual aid and cooperation, a cornerstone of resilience, as seen in Section 19, became deeply ingrained. While feudal systems persisted, the reliance on local networks of support was a profound cultural. Take away this idea of the community pulling together in times of hardship is a direct echo from those brutal winters. You still see it in rural communities today. That inherent trust and reliance on your neighbors when times get tough. One quirky tidbit about this legacy: the enduring popularity of hearty, warming comfort foods in European culinary traditions. Thick breads, root vegetables, strong ales can be directly traced back to the necessity of a high-calorie, storable, and warming diet needed to survive the brutal winters. Think about Irish stew or a thick German rye bread. These weren't just delicious, they were survival staples. Historians still argue whether the lasting preference for certain food types is purely cultural or if it represents a subtle, genetic adaptation to environments that historically favored high-calorie, resilient diets. Even our modern cultural understanding of winter, though often romanticized, carries faint echoes of this brutality. The imagery of warmth, light, and gathering around a fire during the festive season, remember those grim celebrations from Section 15, holds a deeper significance because of centuries when those things were not just desirable but essential for survival. Our comfort now is built upon the foundation of their hardship. We enjoy our cozy evenings because they endured countless cold ones. The sheer unpredictability of climate during the Little Ice Age also ingrained a deeper respect, or perhaps fear, of nature's power. While we now have technology to mitigate much of winter's severity, the historical memory of nature as an overwhelming, uncontrollable force persisted for centuries. It's a subtle shift in perspective, but it means that even today, a severe blizzard can evoke a primal sense of vulnerability. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, wrapped in your warm blankets, perhaps with a soft hum from a fan in the background, consider the invisible threads connecting you to those who shivered through medieval winters. Their enduring struggle, their quiet resilience, and their hard-won adaptations forged a legacy that still shapes our world, reminding us of the profound power of nature and the indomitable spirit of humanity.